A long time ago, nearly 2,000 years back, the followers of Jesus were spreading his teachings across the world. People were amazed by his words, his miracles, and most importantly, his message of salvation. But not everyone who believed in him had the chance to see or hear him directly. Many depended on stories passed down by his disciples. Among those disciples was a man named Matthew. Before he met Jesus, Matthew was a tax collector. People didn't like tax collectors because they often worked for the Romans and took more money than needed. But Jesus looked at Matthew differently. One day, Jesus walked by his booth and simply said, "Follow me." Without hesitation, Matthew stood up, left everything behind, and became one of Jesus' 12 closest followers. Now imagine Matthew, sitting at a table with ink and parchment many years after Jesus had risen into heaven. The church had grown, and followers of Christ were scattered in many cities. Stories about Jesus were being told everywhere, but Matthew realized something very important. Backhand index pointing right. If the story of Jesus was only passed by word of mouth, some details might be forgotten, changed, or misunderstood. So, with a steady hand and a prayerful heart, Matthew decided to write down the story of Jesus. Why did Matthew write? Matthew wanted to show that Jesus was the promised Messiah the Jewish people had been waiting for. That is why his book begins with a long family tree, tracing Jesus all the way back to Abraham and King David. He wanted every Jewish reader to see, this Jesus is the one the prophets spoke about. He carefully collected memories of Jesus' teachings, his parables, his miracles, his death, and his resurrection. Matthew was like a storyteller who didn't just want people to know what Jesus did, but also what Jesus meant. What makes Matthew's writing special? Matthew arranged his book almost like a teacher making a lesson plan. He grouped Jesus' teachings into sections. The most famous one is the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Matthew also made sure to connect the life of Jesus with the old prophecies. Over and over, he wrote things like, "This happened to fulfill what the prophet said." He wanted everyone to see that Jesus wasn't just another wise man. He was the Savior God had promised. When and where was it written? Most historians believe Matthew wrote his gospel around 50 to 70 AD, maybe in Antioch in Syria, where there were many Jewish believers. At that time, Jerusalem had been destroyed, and the Jewish people were scattered. Writing the gospel gave them hope, reminding them that God's promises had not failed. Jesus was still the king, even if Rome ruled the land. The impact of Matthew's gospel. As Matthew's scroll was copied and carried from city to city, believers read it aloud in gatherings. Imagine sitting in a small room lit by oil lamps, with people gathered closely together. A leader would unroll the parchment and read Matthew's words. The birth of Jesus. The miracles of healing. The teachings about love and forgiveness. The crucifixion, the resurrection, and the Great Commission. Each time, hearts were moved, and faith grew stronger. For new believers, the book of Matthew became a guide to understanding who Jesus really was. For Jewish believers, it was proof that their hope in the Messiah was fulfilled. Why it still matters today. Over 2,000 years later, Matthew's Gospel is still one of the most read books in the entire world. His words remind us that Jesus came not only for the Jewish people, but for all nations. At the very end of his book, Matthew writes Jesus' final command. Go and make disciples of all nations. Those words have been the heartbeat of Christianity ever since. Conclusion, 10-minute wrap-up. So when we ask, how was the book of Matthew written, the answer is more than just ink on paper. It was the careful work of a man who once collected taxes, but later collected the stories of salvation. Matthew wrote so that no one would forget who Jesus is, why he came, and how his life fulfilled God's promises. And today, whenever we open the Gospel of Matthew, we are reading the same story that first believers heard in candlelit rooms nearly 2,000 years ago, a story that still changes lives.